in turn mistakenly arrested at the Capitol, and the truth that shook Congress. They slammed his face into the marble before asking for his name. By the time someone realized he wore a congressional intern badge, he was already bleeding onto the Capitol floor. No one could forget the image. Julian Reese, 22, his glasses broken, lip cut, and wrist swollen red from zip-tie cuffs. He looked like a suspect from the evening news. But Julian wasn't a criminal. He was a political science major from Howard University, interning under Senator Whitaker, the same senator who, ironically, once prided himself on bridging the racial divide in government. Julian's mother watched it unfold on live television, her son's body slammed against a pillar of democracy, manhandled by men in suits and earpieces, while tourists screamed and security shouted about an urgent threat. What had he done? He had reached into his messenger bag. That's all it took. A young black man reaching into a bag in the wrong building, wearing a navy suit just a shade too dark for the comfort of the men who still saw shadows where they should see staffers. They said later that someone had called in a threat, a vague description about a man with dark skin and a suspicious package walking toward the Russell Rotunda. The call came from an anonymous source. It wasn't verified, but it was enough. Julian had been delivering folders for a committee hearing. It took 4 hours before they realized their mistake. For hours of questioning, being pinned in a back hallway while security scrambled to contain the breach. For hours while the real threat, if there ever was one, walked free. Senator Whitaker didn't respond to calls. Neither did his chief of staff. Julian sat in silence, surrounded by badges and stares, listening to buzzwords like procedure, protocol, and unfortunate. He knew better than to speak. His father had taught him early. They don't hear you when you're right. They only hear you when you shout, and then they'll use the volume to ignore the message. When the agents finally apologized, they handed him back his broken phone and told him, "We'll take care of this internally." Julian nodded, and then he did something no one expected. He spoke. Not to the press. Not on social media. He sent an email to every intern in the building, to every junior aide, to every young face who knew what it was like to be invisible until you were suddenly a target. Subject line: what happens when your name tag isn't enough? By the next morning, over 300 staffers had shared their own stories. Misidentification, harassment, being mistaken for janitors, delivery men, or even trespassers. It was no longer about Julian. It had never just been about Julian. An intern in Senator Pacheco's office had once been followed by Capitol Police for 3 floors. A Latina aide for the Judiciary Committee was told she couldn't possibly work there. A disabled black veteran who handled policy briefings was once forced to show his ID 3 times in the same day. Within a week, a movement began to stir, quiet but persistent. Hashtags flooded X. Anonymous op-eds started surfacing. A photo of Julian's bloodstained badge made the front page of the Washington Post. And then someone leaked the call. The anonymous threat report that led to Julian's arrest. A recording. Choppy, slightly distorted, but clear enough. The voice wasn't frantic. It was calm, controlled, almost rehearsed. And it wasn't anonymous at all. It belonged to one of the Capitol's own. Julian sat on a bench outside the Library of Congress, earbuds in, heart pounding as the truth broke open across the city. His phone buzzed nonstop. Senators were issuing statements. Committees were demanding hearings. But the voice in the recording didn't surprise him. He recognized it instantly, because he had heard it every morning. "Morning, Julian," the man would say. "How's that big college brain working today?" It was Thomas Greer, the head of internal security, the man who checked his badge on day 1, the same man who once told Julian not to bring those kinds of headphones into the building because they look like you're trying to hide something, the same man who now claimed he saw Julian acting erratically and reported it to his team, escalating the response. Except footage showed otherwise. It showed Julian calmly walking, holding folders, talking briefly with another intern, and entering through a secured door with his badge clearly visible. The suspicious behavior? Julian taking out his phone, adjusting his earbuds, and reaching into his bag for a folder. That was it. Congress erupted. Julian became a name shouted from podiums, a rallying cry, a symbol. But he didn't want to be a symbol. He just wanted to finish the summer program. He wanted to walk through those marble halls without being afraid of his own shadow or worse, someone else's idea of who he might be. But something had changed. A staffer from Senator Pacheco's office asked him to speak at a hearing. First, he declined. Then the threats started rolling in, not from protesters, but from within. Warnings. Whispers. You're going to tank your future. Nobody hires the troublemaker. Let this go quietly, and we'll make sure you have a job waiting. Julian didn't speak at the hearing. He waited 3 days, and then he walked into a live town hall broadcast and sat beside 4 other staffers, black, brown, Muslim, queer, and he spoke anyway. Not just about what happened to him, but what happens in every quiet hallway where people pretend not to see, not to hear, not to feel. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The whole room was already holding its breath. Julian didn't sleep the night after the broadcast. He lay in his twin bed at the apartment provided for Capitol interns, staring up at the ceiling fan as it spun in slow, mechanical loops. The voices played over in his head, his own, steady and clear, and the ones of the interns who sat beside him, sharing truths that no one had ever asked for before. He wasn't sure what he expected afterward. Maybe a polite nod from the powers that be. Maybe a quiet, courteous dismissal. What he got was something else entirely. The morning after the broadcast, Senator Whitaker's office issued a carefully worded statement. While we regret the unfortunate events involving one of our interns, we reaffirm our commitment to safety and security in the Capitol. We support all efforts to improve the experiences of our diverse staff members through dialogue and process reforms. No apology, no mention of Julian by name, just a slick layer of political varnish painted over the wreckage. But the story had outgrown containment. The clip of the town hall exploded across social media. People weren't just retweeting. They were demanding answers, demanding action. Julian walked into the Hart Senate office building that morning to stares, some sympathetic, others calculating. In the elevator, a white aide from another office pressed the button for the 5th floor and said, without looking at him, "Took guts to do what you did." Julian nodded. "Thanks. You're probably done, though," the aide added, still not looking. "Hope it was worth it." Julian didn't respond. He didn't need to, because something else happened later that day, something that flipped the scales again. The Capitol Security Oversight Subcommittee issued a formal request for Greer to testify under oath. It wasn't just about the false report anymore. It was about patterns. Allegations were beginning to pile up. Former staffers, past interns. One even claimed Greer once asked her to translate for a janitor because she looked like she spoke Spanish. She was Korean American. The testimonies came pouring in at first, quietly, then publicly. Greer was placed on administrative leave, but not before he gave a live interview with the Capitol Ledger. In it, he claimed he had acted by the book. That intern was acting suspiciously. I called it in. That's what I'm paid to do. If we'd ignored it and something had gone wrong, this would be a very different conversation. People forget that this is a post-9/11 world. When asked whether race had anything to do with his decision, Greer laughed and leaned forward. "I don't see color," he said. "I see behavior. That's all." That sentence sparked outrage like dry grass catching fire. I don't see color. People were done pretending that phrase meant anything anymore. Julian watched the interview from his phone at a cafe just off Pennsylvania Avenue. His hand tightened around the coffee cup until the cardboard crinkled. A few tables away, a group of junior staffers were arguing quietly. "This could get ugly," one said. "They're gonna make him a martyr." "No," another said, shaking her head. "He made himself a mirror. They just don't like what they see in it." By week's end, the Judiciary Committee had scheduled a formal inquiry. The pressure wasn't just national. It was internal. Staffers, especially interns of color, were threatening a walkout. An anonymous letter, signed by over 500 junior employees across multiple government buildings, was sent to the Speaker's office. If we are trusted to write your memos, schedule your meetings, draft your speeches, and uphold your calendars, then we deserve safety, dignity, and recognition. We are not threats. We are not mistakes. We are not invisible. Julian's name wasn't on the letter, but his words echoed through every line. He didn't want credit. He wanted change. And that's why, when Representative Lillian Ford, the only black woman on the Oversight Committee, requested to meet him privately, he hesitated. He knew what happened when politicians wanted a photo op. But she didn't want a photo. She wanted a story. Her office was warm, full of books and soft yellow lighting. Julian noticed framed art on the walls, black artists, Harlem Renaissance prints, a signed poster from James Baldwin's documentary. Representative Ford offered him water and motioned to the chair across from her. "I've read everything," she said, "but I want to hear it from you." Julian hesitated. "You already know what happened. I know the headlines, but I want to hear the silences." That line stopped him cold. So he told her. Not just the day of the arrest, but the days before. The stares, the subtle slights, the 2 times he was asked to show ID while his white colleagues were waved through. The time he corrected a senior aide's legal error and got told to know your place, rookie. The time he offered a solution during a policy brainstorm and was told, "Let the big dogs talk." He told her about the whispers that followed him after the town hall, about the way people stopped meeting his eyes in the hallway, about how his own supervisor had gone completely silent. When he finished, Ford nodded slowly. "You're not alone." "I know," he said, "but sometimes it still feels like it." Ford stood and pulled a folder from her desk drawer. She passed it to him. Inside was a draft bill. Title: The Intern Protection and Inclusion Act. It proposed mandated anti-bias training for all Capitol security and staff, legal protections for interns reporting discrimination, and the creation of a bipartisan oversight board led by rotating junior staff representatives. "I'm going to introduce this next session," Ford said, "but it'll die on the floor unless we make noise." Julian stared at the folder. "You want me to, what, campaign for it?" "I want you to live it. Loudly, honestly, relentlessly." He didn't answer right away. But when he finally stood to leave, he turned and said, "Okay, let's shake the floor." Over the next month, Julian became more than a symbol. He became a speaker, a strategist, a spark. He led listening sessions across Capitol Hill for interns and junior staff. He organized a summit titled Voices in the Marble that drew over 1,000 attendees. He co-authored an editorial in The Atlantic with Representative Ford and 2 other interns titled, "This House Belongs to Us, Too." He wasn't asking for pity. He was demanding clarity. One question, over and over: who gets to belong in power? And why? Then came the bombshell hearing. Greer was subpoenaed. The footage played. The voice recordings aired. Under oath, he admitted he could have interpreted things differently. He apologized if anyone felt uncomfortable. But the damage was done. The committee ruled that Greer's actions were influenced by implicit racial bias and gross negligence in procedural judgment. He was terminated and barred from future federal employment pending civil litigation. But more than that, policy started shifting. Ford's bill passed committee by a narrow vote. Julian was in the gallery when the motion carried. He didn't clap. He didn't cheer. He closed his eyes and breathed. Back in his apartment that night, he stood in front of the mirror. He stared at the faint bruise still fading under his chin. He thought about what his father once said: "Don't let them write your story for you. They'll make you a villain or a tragedy. Never a full person." Julian wasn't a villain. He wasn't a tragedy. He was a full person. And now, finally, he was being heard. Julian didn't realize how much had changed until his name was printed not in bold headlines this time, but in the footnote of a bill. Testimony of Julian Reese, intern for Senator Whitaker, provided critical context for the final language of the Intern Protection and Inclusion Act. It was just a sentence. But to Julian, It felt like a door had been unlocked somewhere deep inside a building no one ever thought he'd be allowed to enter. The day the bill passed the House, a reporter stopped him outside the Capitol steps. "Julian, one question," she called, catching up with him. "Do you think real change is possible here?" Julian smiled. Not wide, not naive, but honest. "It better be," he said, "because we're not waiting anymore." Still, not everyone was celebrating. In a closed-door meeting the next morning, several senior aides expressed concern about the precedent Julian was setting. A few even called for a cap on intern media engagement, warning that the structure of hierarchy is being threatened. Julian heard about the meeting through a friend who sat 3 chairs away. "They're scared," she texted him. "You're not playing the part. They don't know what to do when someone refuses to shrink." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew now that speaking wasn't just an act of courage, it was an act of defiance against an entire system built on who gets to be heard. But courage, he learned, has a price. And Julian was about to pay it again. A week after the bill passed the House, Senator Whitaker's office announced a realignment of intern roles due to shifting office needs. Julian was quietly removed from the intern roster. No warning, no explanation, no farewell, just gone. His badge stopped working the next morning. When he called the intern coordinator, she offered a bland excuse about overcapacity and administrative reevaluation. When he pushed further, she lowered her voice. "You didn't hear this from me," she said. "But someone upstairs decided you were too visible, too controversial." Julian laughed bitterly. "Controversial for being tackled on the floor?" "No," she said. "Controversial for standing back up." Julian packed his things in silence. The office was nearly empty. On his desk was a yellow sticky note with the words, "Keep going. They can't erase what's real." There was no name, but he recognized the handwriting. Marisol, the Latina staffer who had once been told she couldn't possibly work there. He slipped the note into his notebook. Outside the building, the city felt different. It wasn't that he was out of a job. It wasn't that the internship was over. It was that he now understood the machinery behind the marble, how power preserved itself, even as it pretended to change. But this time, Julian had something else. He had people, a network, a story that belonged to more than just him. And he wasn't going to let it die in silence. A week later, Julian was invited to appear on Real Voices with Carmen Ellis, a nationally syndicated podcast known for its raw, unfiltered conversations about politics, race, and systems of oppression. They recorded at night. Just 2 microphones. 1 room. Carmen didn't waste time. "So, Julian," she began, her voice steady but fierce. "You were arrested, lied about, then fired for telling the truth, and now they want you to disappear. What do you want to say to them?" Julian paused. He hadn't rehearsed. He didn't need to. "I'm not going anywhere." Carmen leaned in. "What do you say to the people who claim this was all about security, not race?" "I say security doesn't slam a white intern's face into the ground for pulling out a folder." She nodded. "What scares them the most about you?" Julian looked straight into the mic. "That I'm not afraid of being seen anymore." The episode went viral, and something shifted. Again, Julian's inbox filled overnight. Invitations, interview requests, messages from former staffers, now professors, lawyers, organizers. But one email stood out. Subject, "Let's build something." From Danielle at newgroundscoalition.org. Julian opened it. "Hey Julian, I've been following everything. I'm the policy director for the New Grounds Coalition, a multiracial, cross-party org dedicated to reshaping how power is distributed in American institutions. We think you're the kind of voice we need, not as a symbol, but as a builder. Wanna grab coffee?" He read it 3 times, then typed back, "Yes." Danielle was 35, sharp, and spoke like every sentence was already part of a strategy. She'd once worked on the Obama campaign, then burned out on what she called performative progress. Now she ran a team of policy architects trying to turn protest into infrastructure. Over coffee, she explained her idea. "We're launching a new initiative, she said. Youth Infrastructure Fellowship designed to place formerly marginalized interns into roles with actual policy influence. Julian raised an eyebrow. You mean a bunch of us working from the inside? Danielle smiled. Not just inside. Everywhere. State houses, city boards, federal commissions. We're done playing small. She slid a folder toward him. Be our first fellow. Design it with us. Build it from scratch. Julian opened the folder. His hands shook slightly. Inside was a blank template titled Systemic Equity Pipeline. He looked up. You sure you want me to lead this? No, she said. I need you to. 3 months later, Julian stood at a podium in Atlanta for the launch of the pilot program. Behind him were banners that read the pipeline project in bold white text. In front of him sat dozens of new interns, black, brown, indigenous, immigrant, most of whom had never stepped foot in a government building before. You're not here to be the exception, Julian told them. You're here to become the new standard. He told them what happened. Not to scare them, but to prepare them. And he told them something else. They'll try to make you choose. Safety or voice. Acceptance or truth. Don't fall for it. Your story is not a liability. It's a blueprint. The crowd erupted. Julian stepped off stage into a sea of outstretched hands. And for the first time since that day in the Capitol, he felt it. Not fear. Not rage. Not even vindication. But momentum. That fall, he was invited to testify again, this time before a Senate panel evaluating racial bias in federal hiring pipelines. His testimony wasn't emotional. It was surgical. He laid out the data. He named the failures. He presented alternatives. And when one senator scoffed and asked, "Are you suggesting the system is rigged?" Julian looked him dead in the eye. "I'm saying the system is working exactly as it was designed." Silence fell. No one rebutted. The next day, Julian received a call. Unknown number. He answered anyway. A quiet voice spoke. "This is Thomas Greer." Julian froze. "I'm not calling to defend myself," Greer continued. "I'm calling because I saw your hearing. And for the first time, I listened." Julian didn't say anything. "I lost everything," Greer said. "But maybe I never deserved to keep it. I just wanted you to know I was wrong." Julian inhaled, and then said, "Good." He hung up. He didn't need closure. He had movement. Months passed. The headlines faded. The hearings concluded. New controversies replaced old ones. But something had changed beneath the surface, something deeper than press releases or sound bites. It wasn't just that people now knew Julian's name. It was that they couldn't forget what he'd revealed. The doors that used to creak shut behind interns of color now had eyes on them. The conversations once whispered in the hallways had moved to committee floors. And somewhere in that massive, historic machine of marble and red tape a crack had formed. Julian didn't romanticize it, but he knew it mattered. In February, he was invited to return to the Capitol not as an intern, not as a witness, but as a keynote speaker for the inaugural Capitol Inclusion Forum, a new tradition founded by staff members across party lines. He stood in the exact same rotunda where he'd once been shoved, cuffed, and dragged. Now there was a podium waiting for him. As the crowd settled, he looked up. Above him, the fresco of George Washington rising into the heavens, surrounded by angels, painted in pastel strokes. Below him, staffers, interns, aides, security officers, some who had seen, some who had ignored, some who had changed. He took a breath and began. "I'm not here to relive what happened to me. I'm here to remind you that what happened to me was never just about me. It was about a story this place has told itself for centuries. A story that says certain people belong and others are guests. That power wears a suit, speaks a certain way, knows the right handshake. That safety is a mirror that only reflects one kind of face. That if you're lucky enough to get inside, your job is to stay quiet, say thank you, and never ask why the rules are the way they are." Well, I asked, and what I found was silence. But then I found you. The ones who refused to let silence be the last word. So no, I'm not here to ask for space anymore. I'm here to build it. And I won't do it alone. The rotunda went quiet. Then applause. Then a standing ovation that rolled through the marble like thunder through a canyon. After the speech, a Capitol police officer approached Julian. Not one he recognized. The man extended his hand. "I watched the footage," he said quietly. "I've been rewatching it for months. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I didn't stop it. I should have." Julian took his hand. "You can still start now," he said. By summer, the Intern Protection and Inclusion Act had been fully implemented across federal government buildings. New interns from historically underrepresented communities were entering spaces where they'd previously been told to keep their heads down. Julian didn't stay in Washington. He chose something bigger. With Danielle and a team of young policy architects, he expanded the pipeline project into 10 states, partnering with local governments and grassroots orgs to create paid, protected public internships. His face wasn't on every flyer. His name wasn't in every press release. But his blueprint was everywhere. And in the places where it mattered most, people knew. This started because one kid refused to stay quiet. 1 year after his arrest, Julian returned home to Baltimore for a local town hall. His father, a high school history teacher, introduced him. "This is my son," he said, voice thick with pride. He changed the rules without waiting for permission. The crowd laughed, then cheered. Julian stepped up, looking out at the kids in the front row, some of whom wore their Sunday best just to ask questions about how to apply for internships. One girl, maybe 12, raised her hand. "Mr. Julian," she asked, "when they arrested you, were you scared?" He didn't lie. "Yeah," he said. "I was terrified." "Then how come you kept going?" Julian looked at her, this bright-eyed girl who would walk into a world that still hadn't decided if she belonged in it. "Because the worst thing they did wasn't tackle me," he said. "It was trying to convince me I was alone. And once I realized I wasn't, nothing could stop me." She nodded and smiled. Later that night, Julian sat with his dad on the porch, the air thick with summer heat and distant sirens. "You think it's really changing?" his dad asked. Julian took a sip of sweet tea, thought for a moment. "Not fast enough," he said. "But it is." His dad nodded. "You gonna go back?" "To D.C.? Julian shook his head. "Maybe. One day. But not as an intern." His dad raised an eyebrow. "Then what?" Julian smiled. "Maybe as someone who writes the rules." 2 years later, a young congresswoman stood at the Capitol steps, surrounded by supporters, journalists, and community leaders. Her name was Ariel Brooks, a former pipeline fellow, daughter of immigrants, and the first black woman under 30 elected to represent her district. In her first public address, she thanked many. But she paused when she reached one name. "I wouldn't be here," she said, "if not for Julian Reese." The cameras zoomed in. "He showed us that truth can survive arrest, that dignity can survive silence, and that if you tell your story loud enough, long enough, even the halls of power have to listen." The crowd roared. Backstage, Julian stood off to the side. He wasn't holding a microphone, but he didn't need one. The echo of his voice, once dismissed, once buried, was now being carried by others. And that was the point all along. The Capitol building didn't crumble. No statues fell. No ancient laws vanished overnight. But one crack had spread across the polished surface, deep, undeniable, and permanent. Not damage. Not destruction. Change. And through that crack, a new generation had stepped in, not asking for permission, not apologizing for existing, but building. Together. And Julian kept going. Not as a martyr, not as a symbol, but as what he always had been, a full person.